Today I'm working on another tanuki. Removing wire that's biting in, thinning out old or weak foliage, removing some of the fasteners used to create this planting, applying some aluminium wire to create foliage pads, and building an entirely new apex. I consider the techniques that I use to attach the whip and those that we use to prepare the deadwood trunk. If you find the following content helpful, then you can thank me by clicking the thanks button just below the video. Welcome back, you're with Terry of Bonsai Tree, and today I'm going to be working on another one of my trees that just happened to be a tanuki. And in this tanuki I have used a juniper whip to attach to a dead juniper limb. To get started, I'm going to be using the green tea mini table, which is a very versatile table. It allows me to attach a tree and change the angle, spin it around. The first task that I need to complete is to remove wire that was previously applied in the styling of this tree that is now biting in somewhat severely, and I'm going to be removing that wire just with my fingers. The evidence of this wire bite is probably going to disappear in a season or two, and in fact it's actually desirable or a good idea to keep the wire on these younger branches on junipers when you're styling them until they start forming wire bite, because removing the wire too prematurely will mean that the branches will just return back to their original position very often. Next, I'm going to be removing old foliage or weak foliage, generally on the interior of the tree, as this will make the styling or new addition of wire much easier and quicker. Foliage which emerges from the top or the bottom of a pad or branch is also going to be removed. Some foliage is also removed in order to create space between branchlets. These cable ties have been used till now in order to secure the whip as firmly against the dead trunk as possible, but they've now served their purpose and therefore can be removed. Some branches are going to need to be shortened so that they fit the profile that I have in mind for the tree. For that work, you can use any number of tools. A decent pair of scissors will work, a branch cutter, or in this case, as I'm using a narrow branch cutter because of the slimness of the blade, it allows me to get into the canopy of the tree very easily. As I go through the tree section by section and thinking about the kind of foliage pad that I'm going to create, I'm also bringing the branches together and almost test fitting them to see how they can form the pad, and then removing the branches that will not be necessary or cutting the branches back that will be overly long for the pad. This saves time for me to apply wire to a branch that ultimately I cut out, or it also saves time and wire for wiring a long branch and then cutting the branch a lot shorter. However, this foresight of how things are going to fit together does come with experience, and if you don't have that experience yet, it's probably better to keep more branches than what you think you will need, and also to keep them a little bit longer than you think you will need, and then you can always cut them back or remove them later. When creating volume on foliage pads, the layering of shorter foliage as it recedes back towards the main or the structural branch is what creates the volume. That approach is applicable as I'm working with a scale type of foliage juniper. When you're working with needle type of juniper, such as the Procumbens nana, which is a very popular juniper species for bonsai, then very often foliage pads are created with branchlets or small growth portions growing vertically upwards from the structural portion of the branch. When you're thinning branches, such as I'm working on this one, preparing it for creating a foliage pad with, you always need to bear in mind the space that the branches are going to need around them in order to develop in the future. On this tree, I'm using aluminium wire as it's cheaper and very easy to apply, but you can also use copper, and in fact copper is preferable because it has a far better hold on the branches than aluminium wire does. Copper wire work hardens as you bend it, and this means that once you've placed a bend into the branch that has been wired with copper wire, it has a much better chance of holding that exact position. Whereas with aluminium wire, there is a tendency, especially with thicker branches, for those branches to return somewhat to their original position after you've wired it. And so it sort of seems as if the branch is bending after you've bent it into the position that you wanted it. I'm a little concerned that the upper portion of this tanuki is going to separate away from the deadwood trunk, and so I'm just going to secure that with a piece of rubber hose and wire passed through that, and that will ensure that when I'm wiring the apical portion of the tree, that I'm not pulling it away from the deadwood. All of the branches are given a slightly downward droop to them, as this indicates or suggests a tree with maturity, unlike a tree that has horizontal branches or branches that are growing towards the sun, which generally refers or implies a younger tree. However, giving the tips of the branchlets a slight upward bend towards the sunlight will strengthen them. When you're having to shorten branches on a juniper, it's advisable not to cut back further than branches that have vigorous or very healthy looking foliage on it. I would also add that you want to remove as little foliage as you possibly can, because the more foliage that a juniper has, the stronger it will grow. It's always advisable to work with a very healthy tree if you expect it to respond well to bonsai techniques or the typical techniques that we apply to them, such as in this case wiring. With the design of this tree, I potentially have two apices. The first apex is the one on the left-hand side, which is the deadwood trunk, and the second is the apex to the right, which is formed by, or will be formed by, the live foliage. From a design perspective, it would not be advisable to have these apices on the same level. So I spent a little time deciding which apex I wanted to have as the highest point, and in the end decided that the deadwood trunk apex would be the one that would be the highest, and the live area would be slightly lower. In order to bring the live apex down, essentially compacting it, I had to put a heavier wire onto this portion of the trunk and then bring that area down. In building an apex initially from a raw state or bush, basically, you're needing to cheat quite a bit, in the sense that the apex is the densest portion of the tree, and therefore this is where you need the most foliage. But if you don't have it, then you need to use what is available to you and then bend it around and display it in such a way that it looks to create the illusion of volume. However, this is just a temporary phase that the tree's development is going through, and ultimately you're going to select new branches that emerge or gain in vigor and restyle the apex several times over potentially, so that the branch angles are more preferable. It's very difficult to explain exactly what I am referring to by this previous comment, but essentially you're having to maneuver or position or reposition branches at all sorts of weird angles, twisting them and bending them in order to have the terminals or the tips of those branches fit the profile of the tree that you have in mind, and also to create the volume that you're wanting. But as I mentioned, this is not a long-term solution. You will most likely have to redesign the apex and get branches that are better positioned to fill those spaces, and then you'll eventually cut out those all sorts of crazy wonky bends. In my opinion, this whip has formed very nicely against the deadwood trunk, and you actually can't see any gaps in that. The shot blasting that I used to treat the deadwood trunk prior to attaching the whip is also really aged beautifully, and considering that this planting is only 2 years old, I really think that it has a lot of potential going forward. In my opinion, there's too much negative space, meaning the space between foliage pads still in the design, but that will be filled up in time. If you found that content helpful and you'd like to thank me for it, please do so now by clicking the thanks button just below the video. My previous videos on the subject of tanuki was very well received. Of course, not everybody approves of tanuki, but I think it's a fantastic option available to those of us that can't get a hold of really old collected junipers with lots of deadwood and interesting live veins. So we can now create it with relatively inexpensive material.